Welcome back to Historical Context. Today we conclude the Narvaez expedition and the journey of Cabeza de Vaca. And if this is your first time listening to the Narvaez expedition, I suggest you go back to the prior 4 episodes and listen before today as we conclude this journey. And where we last left off, Cabeza de Vaca was alone with a group of natives inland. He was waiting for another group of natives to come who were accompanied by a few European survivors, approximately 3. Cabeza de Vaca had accompanied these natives to meet up with the other Europeans. And so finally these groups merge, and there are the 3 European survivors are there. They join Cabeza de Vaca, and they decide to leave. But they feel they have to do it in secret from the natives because they're not sure the natives would allow them to leave. So they had to wait 6 more months for the opportunity to leave. During this time, another group of natives comes to the village and takes Cabeza de Vaca and the Europeans as slaves. During this time, one of the men who was actually in one of the missing barges that has not been accounted for yet. So this European survivor is actually a new person who has come about. He was from a ship that had not been accounted for until now. He describes how another barge had been swept out from the inlet and sunk, and this would be around Galveston. So this man describes how his barge was swept out from the inlet and sunk. And while they were walking along the shore of the river, now keep in mind this had happened 6 years prior, Narvaez's barge approached them. Narvaez demoted one of the men and anchored the boat but did not come ashore. And so it looked as if this expedition was going to merge, but that night a strong wind swept the boat out to sea, and Narvaez was never seen again. While we don't get total conclusion as to what happened to Narvaez, one of the survivors of this 3-man group was actually able to provide an eyewitness account as to what happened. And it's believed that Narvaez was one of a very few men on that ship when it was swept out. This survivor, after talking about Narvaez sweeping out to sea, goes on to describe what happened to his group after that. He says they found shelter in a timber where they had access to food and water, but as winter came, men began to die. The leader of their group was treating them poorly, and in fact, he got killed when he got in a fight with another member of the expedition. As winter went on, more men died, and the survivors turned to cannibalism to survive. It's a repetitive story here. Only one man out of this entire group survived. And that man actually crossed paths with somebody else who ended up telling this story. That man, that sole survivor, decided to stay with the natives. So I'm corrected from an assumption I made earlier about this guy being an eyewitness. He actually came across a survivor who decided to stay with the tribe. The man goes on to discuss other stories he had heard, including Europeans who were killed by natives. In one case, a native woman had a dream that this European had killed her son, so the village killed this individual. The men go on to discuss and kind of compare notes between the different tribes they had been with and what their customs were. They discovered that 2 of the tribes rejected any girls that were born, and any girls that were born were actually killed. And this was because they feared that the girls would marry their enemies, multiply, and then overtake their tribe. So how would they account for the shortage of women? They would go and buy their wives from enemy tribes. Some practices here are just downright odd, I guess. Let's hear what Cabeza de Vaca has to say. They kill their own children and buy those of strangers. Marriage only lasts as long as they please. For a mere nothing, they break up wedlock. He goes on to describe their diet, which mainly consisted of roots. Let's have a look. Many are very bitter, and with that they are gathered in great difficulty. Now and then they kill deer and at times get a fish, but this is so little and their hunger so great that they eat spiders and ant eggs, worms, lizards, and salamanders, and serpents, also vipers, the bite of which is deadly. They swallow earth and wood, the dung of deer, and more things that I do not mention. I'm kind of glad, especially if you're eating right now, that he goes on to stop mentioning what the other things are. I mean, if deer dung and dirt is bad enough, I can't imagine what else there is. So clearly the tribe is not established in a way where it can generate a consistent food supply, especially since it's eating like this. Cabeza de Vaca goes on to mention that the women and the elderly do all of the hard work because they are least respected, and the children of this tribe are not treated well. So different tribes, slightly different customs. Cabeza de Vaca goes on to mention that bugs were also a problem. There were a great many mosquitoes of 3 kinds, all very bad and troublesome, which during most of the summer persecuted us. In order to protect ourselves, we built, all around our camps, big fires of damp and rotten wood that gave no flame but much smoke. And this was the cause of further trouble to us. For the whole night we did not do anything but weep from the smoke that went into our eyes. So it's creating one problem to avoid another for the expedition at this point, and mosquitoes being persecuting the Europeans. An interesting word choice for Cabeza de Vaca. He then goes on to mention eating cows, and cows are domesticated in the Spanish culture, but he calls them cows here in America. Let's take a look at the description. Here also they come up with cows. They appear to me of the size of those in Spain. Their horns are small, like those of Moorish cattle. The hair is very long, like fine wool. Some are brownish and others black. So essentially what Cabeza de Vaca is talking about, he is the first European to lay his eyes on buffalo. And buffalo hides, so natives would eat buffalo on occasion, and buffalo hides were used by the natives as blankets. So the 6 months that they were waiting for passed, and on the day they were going to execute their plans, the natives got in a huge fight with one another, and everybody had to be separated. So the plan to get away was delayed. And over the next several months, Cabeza de Vaca unsuccessfully tried to escape 3 separate times. But finally, the group is able to escape these natives. And Cabeza de Vaca, being now in what is probably inland Texas, makes an observation of the land. Let's have a look. All over the land are vast and handsome pastures with good grass for cattle, and it strikes me the soil would be very fertile were the country inhabited and improved by reasonable people. So there Cabeza de Vaca is making a suggestion about what he thinks the land could be used for in the event of a settlement. And it's interesting, good grass for cattle, fertile soil, talking about an area of the country that is high in the cattle trade and has been for a long time. The Europeans flee, and 2 days into their journey, they see smoke rising from a village, and they decide to go towards it. A native sees them and runs, but they're able to catch up with him, and they tell him that they only want to go into the village. He leads them there, and the natives welcome the Europeans. Cabeza de Vaca mentions that he communicates with them in a different native language. So Cabeza de Vaca has learned at least one native language. He's communicating with them, but they speak a different language. However, they are able to understand each other. The natives offered the men fruit because they had heard of their acts as medicine men in the past. This mention of medicine men is interesting because another survivor goes on to write about this journey, and the medicine men portion is not mentioned very much by this survivor, which has led historians to believe that the medicine men story that Cabeza de Vaca tells may not be as accurate as it was, but we're going to go ahead and tell it anyways, and we're going to tell it with that footnote in mind. So the word is getting out, apparently, that these Europeans are medicine men, and that evening natives came to the village with headaches, and after the men said some prayers and did their ritual, the natives felt better. And this led more and more natives to come to them in the following days, each bringing food. After a few days, the Europeans asked about land further in. And the natives said that there were no people out there because winter was coming, and that they had all gone to their homes for the season. The natives and the Europeans decided together to hunt for food, and during this time Cabeza de Vaca got separated from them and spent 5 days alone in the wilderness. He goes on to mention during his 5 days alone that at one point he had started a fire and accidentally caught himself on fire and was lucky to get out with minimal injury. After Cabeza de Vaca is reunited with everyone, they continue their travels, and they're doing this medicine man work as they're going. And as they're going, their success grows, their popularity grows, and according to Cabeza de Vaca, all 4 men are now performing medicine men tasks. They go from one tribe to another as they're traveling westward, and due to their sun exposure, their skin begins to blister. They also begin to struggle with hunger once again, and they eat raw meat because if they cook it, another native who was with them, accompanying them, would take that meat and eat it. At one point, they purchased and ate 2 dogs. Cabeza de Vaca notes several common traditions amongst the tribes that he is visiting now as he is going from tribe to tribe to tribe. He notes that men do not cohabitate with their wives when they are pregnant, and not until the children are over the age of 2. Children nurse from their mothers until the age of 12. When asked about this, the natives said it was due to the scarcity of food. Husbands would leave their wives if they disagreed and remarry whomever they pleased, unless the couple had children. Quarreling was handled in knockdown, drag-out fights. So these people would fight physically in disagreement. When the tribe settles in for the night, when they're traveling, they could seal their sleeping areas well and actually build fires away from their sleeping areas to distract their enemies. Interesting observations from Cabeza de Vaca, and we're getting to the point in the reading now where a lot of writing occurs, but actually very little happens. So this is what allows us to sort of push this journey forward, if you will. Cabeza de Vaca and his men continue to move from tribe to tribe. At one point, he begins to mention that those with him, those natives, as they go from tribe to tribe, are plundering the new villages they come to. So this ominous practice begins where a tribe enters another native village with the Europeans. The entering natives plunder the village they're coming in, and then those natives move on and look to plunder the next village. So at one point, Cabeza de Vaca mentions that the Europeans are getting annoyed by the group of natives, and the group could tell that the Europeans were upset. And during this time, 8 natives died of sickness. And as a result, this native group, which was following them, began to disperse because they thought the Europeans were so angry that they were the cause of the sickness and the death. Still, several natives remain with them. And to give you an idea of the numbers, it ranges from a couple of hundred to maybe up to 1,000. It's disputed in the various writings how many natives actually were with them, but it seems like they just continued on this journey, and some would drop off and some would add on, and so it was very interesting. At one point, they come upon a native man who was wounded and tells them that he was wounded by a Spaniard, by a European. And Cabeza de Vaca asks, where have these men went? And the man tells them that the group got on their ships and sailed away. And at this point, they are on the west coast of Mexico. And they are coming down the west coast. This becomes the first time Cabeza de Vaca gets any indication they may be near other Europeans. But as they continue to move south, they begin to find villages that are deserted because of European incursion. And I believe, because we're at the year 1536 now, that this is likely related to Hernan Cortez' 1536 expedition, which essentially shadows or goes north through Cabeza de Vaca's trip south. Cabeza de Vaca goes on to talk about seeing the deserted land. Let's have a look. This filled our hearts with sorrow, seeing the land so fertile and beautiful, so full of water and streams, but abandoned, and places burned down, and the people so thin and fleeing and hiding. And so I believe this is related to the Cortez expedition. It occurred in the same year, similar area, and Cabeza de Vaca and his men continue their journey. They come to another village where they're told that the Europeans were just sighted. And when taken to the area where the Europeans were sighted, the stakes at which the horses were tied down were still in the ground. And it was determined that the Europeans were 3 days ahead. But the next morning, let's have a look. The next morning, I came upon 4 Christians on horseback, who, seeing me in such strange attire and in company with Indians, were greatly startled. So at long last, Cabeza de Vaca comes in contact with other Europeans, and obviously they're startled because he's dressed like a native. He's been gone for 7 going on 8 years now. So Cabeza de Vaca is taken to their captain, and he says that 600 natives were traveling with them at the time, and there was a difference of opinion as to what to do with them. So you've got all these natives with the Europeans, and the captain wanted to enslave this group of natives, and Cabeza de Vaca says no and convinces the captain to not enslave them. But then he has to turn and convince the natives to go home, because the natives have a custom to follow people until they reach the next village. So remember earlier we were talking about the plunder, move on, plunder, move on. Apparently that was part of their custom. And so now the natives are like, well, where are we going if we're not following you? And he finally persuades the natives to return home, and the envoy sends some men to accompany Cabeza de Vaca and the European survivors to Culiacan, which is a Spanish settlement, and they are welcomed there. From there, Cabeza de Vaca travels to Compostela, where the governor gives them excellent accommodation. But despite the excellent accommodation, and this is interesting, it reminds me of the movie Castaway, Cabeza de Vaca could not sleep for 2 weeks unless he was sleeping on the dirt floor. Finally, from there, Cabeza de Vaca ends up in Mexico City, where he rests for 2 months. I would need 2 months if I were through the journey he had been on. And he would end up returning to Spain in 1537. And the story of this journey, this Odyssey, if you will, was published in 1542. He would go back to the New World, this time in South America, in current-day Paraguay, and he spent 4 years there from 1540 to 1544. He was in charge of developing the city of Buenos Aires. However, his treatment of the natives rubbed other Europeans the wrong way. He treated the natives well compared to what the other Europeans did. And in 1544, he was arrested and returned to Spain in 1545. He was eventually exonerated, but never explored again, and he died in the late 1550s. So the journey ends, the 8-year Odyssey ends, and I think it's very interesting that there was opportunity along the way to assimilate with the natives, and the notion that other Europeans may have could have very well happened because, as you could tell along the way, the group wasn't totally accounted for. And one of those barges which had the one survivor, there could have been others along the way that survived and assimilated. Cabeza de Vaca's story goes on to entice a man named De Soto, who, not very long after Cabeza de Vaca returns to Spain, decides to lead his own expedition into the southeastern United States. And that's where we will pick up when we return next week to Historical Context.